Okay, we are going to go ahead and start with our next session, which is strategies for advocacy. And we are going to end this session about 5 minutes early so we can transition quickly to the last session of the day. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Giulia.
Yeah, hi everyone, survivors of today. So this is our last panel for today called Strategies for Advocacy. And this session will bring together a very different perspective on aquatic animal welfare, aquaculture, and aquaculture advocacy. So we will be, in a nutshell, be looking at how legal, scientific, and community-based approaches can help shape more effective protections for aquatic animals. Now, let me just start by saying that one of the reasons this topic is so important is that aquaculture is often discussed as if it were like one single sector, but in reality, as we heard throughout today, it includes very different species, production systems, geographies, welfare risks, legal contexts, and much, much more. So this also means that advocacy cannot be one size fits all. And the strategy that might work for one species, one jurisdiction, or one stage of the industry development may not work in another. So we will explore different advocacy strategies, including consumer protection litigation, farmer-centered reform, multi-species and community-based approaches, and a little bit on preemptive legislation. And I now have the pleasure to introduce you, my fellow panelists. We have Becca Franks. She's assistant professor of environmental studies at NYU, and she's the director of the All Animals Initiative for Multi-Species Community Building and the co-director of the Wild Animal Welfare Program. Her research combines quantitative methods and novel conceptual frameworks to understand multi-species communities, interspecies relationships, and animal welfare with a focus on aquatic animals and environments. Then we have Shreya Padukone. I think hope I didn't butcher the last name. She has a background in science and law, and she leads a program at the Animal Law Center and serves as a grant advisor for animal protection at the Pollination Project. Last but not least, we have Sahana Ramdas. Ramdas?
Come back, Louis.
Ramdas.
Yep.
See? Is practicing law in New York with Legal Aid Society. She has an LLM in animal law, global environmental law, and general law. In addition to animal advocacy, she has consumer protection law practice experience in intersectional issues of animal law, global environmental law, and public health. I realized I'm Giulia Malerbi, again, Ian, see? I'm head of global policy at Aquatic Life Institute. So the format of today will be a little bit different from what we've done today. We don't have any fixed presentation. I was a little bit mean with my panelists, asking them to just introduce their work, because I really would love for us to get into discussion. This is really part of my daily work, so I love disagreement. So I hope that we will bring different perspective. I think for animals, we need different approaches. So just for the sake of time, I am also working directly on some of these issues, but because of the panelists that we have, I really want to leave them the time, and so I'll mostly be a moderator today, but I might come in with some insights, especially from the octopus farming ban campaign, which is a big focus for me. Okay, we can get started. So, Becca, I would love for you to please start to help us set a little bit of the broader context. So if you could briefly introduce your work and the perspective that you are bringing to this panel, especially around how aquaculture compares with terrestrial animal agriculture and what that means for advocacy.
Great, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay, or do I need okay. Awesome, thank you. Thank you all for being here. I'm so delighted to be part of this panel. Thank you, Giulia, for the introduction. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me and making such a fantastic symposium. I think it's such an important issue. So I work on mostly animal behavior, animal welfare. I'm very focused on the fishes themselves. And so this law and policy framework, for me, I'm coming to as a bit of an outsider. So I'm sort of thinking big picture, taking a big step back, thinking about forward-looking, what are we going to do, and then mainly just being a cheerleader for all of the amazing work that we've discussed today, and just trying to put a little bit of structure on that. So I think when I think about aquatic animal welfare as it relates to aquaculture, there are kind of two phases. The first phase, characterized the last maybe 20 years, of realizing that we have an issue that's similar to terrestrial animal agriculture in the sense that we have sentient beings in intensive production systems that are being put into situations that are really interfering with their ability to thrive and flourish and actually creating conditions that a lot of people would call cruel. And that you're in this room, you know that that's the case, but as Kathy mentioned this morning, there's still work to be done to allow people to really understand what's happening. So really focusing on meeting people where they're at about fish and not imagining that they don't care about fish, as Abby pointed out. This is an important issue for people, and I think fish are fascinating, and the stories that we tell about them really matter, and you can see things change on a dime, like we saw with my octopus teacher, where now all of a sudden everybody wants to be friends with an octopus. And of course me too. But this is true about fish as well. Fish are incredible beings. They also can change their colors, etc. So I think just sort of celebrating who they are and allowing that to sort of come forward so that these issues can be talked about and weighed with all of the information necessary to make good decisions going forward. So I think that's phase one. We're still in the middle of it, but we've been in it. But then I think phase two is also then just returning to how this is completely unlike terrestrial animal agriculture. It's, as we've heard throughout the day, it's incredibly heterogeneous, it's diversifying, it's heterogeneous in terms of the species that we're farming. There's over 400 different species that are currently being farmed worldwide. Those species are incredibly different from each other. I'd love to get into how, but I don't have time. But yeah, just imagine like huge species that live for like 100 years or more, tight-knit family groups, migratory species, anyway. The systems themselves are incredibly diverse. The producers themselves are incredibly diverse, from smallholders to multinational corporations. And apparently even the planet on which they're farmed is diverse, where we're sending them into space now. And yet, despite this, we're having this call for expansion that reduces it to a single tagline of blue foods. And blue foods are gonna solve food security problems, they're gonna solve environmental problems, they're going to solve worker rights problems, and that's just a complete betrayal of this diverse system. And so this, as we've also heard as a recurring drumbeat throughout the day, creates an opportunity for us to seize the narrative back, not allow this homogenizing effect that really is a true misrepresentation of what's happening, and instead be able to tell these stories in a way that does more and better justice to the animals themselves. And just reflecting and echoing where we started the day, thinking about multi-species communities, multi-species flourishing, decentering the human, recognizing these animals for their own sake and their interconnections with each other and with us. That we can sort of, and it fits in with the One Health narrative about the interrelationships and how we all are relying on each other. And I think that if we begin there with that story and that framing, then we can move forward into policy and recognize that there's a multitude of policy solutions. There's sort of the immediate incremental solutions that need to be done to improve water quality and oxygenation and various sorts of things that are in these existing systems on the ground. Those are essential for those animals that we should consider to be part of our community. But we can also be more forward-looking and trying to get ahead and stop trying to play catch-up and actually be more proactive and thinking about freezing on expansion. We have existing systems in place that requires one response. Maybe expansion is not a wise way forward. How can we have policy tools to sort of freeze expansion and banning certain taxa from being farmed, like octopuses? And then I think we can even go further than that and start thinking about welfare-informed diversification rather than just blanket diversification. So welfare-informed diversification would be looking at seaweeds and all the different kinds of seaweeds and all the amazing things that seaweeds can do, and helping people to transition who want to transition, and really starting to think about plant-forward diets as being a healthier solution for everyone. So I think we can have a multi-tiered approach that really embraces that community, multi-species community perspective. Importantly, the animals are part of the community, we're part of the community, the farmers and producers are part of the community, and we need to figure out how to all start working together.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, Becca. I think that gives us a very good starting point. I'm really curious to dive into later of especially with you, why aquaculture is just not another form of terrestrial animal agriculture, and of course the implication that that has for advocacy. Shreya, now I would like to turn to you and bring the discussion into a little bit the realities of aquacultures on the ground. So if you could please introduce a little bit of your work and the welfare issues that you are seeing in practice.
Right. I really agree with Becca. In fact, she was the one from whom I really learned how different each species are from one another. I remember she'd said in one of her talks that, you know, it's like one species as different from the other as an elephant is from a tiger. And I think from that starting point, I became very curious to see how, I'm a lawyer myself, so just curious to see how these differences in species result in a difference in how these species are regulated. And maybe one step before that, how farmers incorporate practices into how different species are reared and how that then translates into regulation. So the scoping study that I was part of looked at one of this catfish species called Pangasius pangasius. Everybody's spoken a lot about Pangasius, and a couple of catfish species are illegal in India, but Pangasius pangasius is actually is not prohibited from being farmed. But there are four aspects of practices that really stood out in the ways in which different species were reared differently. So one was resilience to pond conditions. So for instance, oxygen levels. So Pangasius are able to withstand much lower levels of dissolved oxygen than other species like Indian major carp, which is farmed at a much higher scale than Pangasius. But it doesn't mean that we should care about Pangasius in terms of scale any less, because they're farmed at a much higher stocking density. So for instance, if IMC, which is Indian major carp, is an average, so to say, stocking density would be 1,500 fishes per acre, and it would probably go up to like 2,000. Pangasius at a very minimum are kept at 10,000 fishes per acre. So that is like a huge increase in stocking density. And then the other aspect that I wanted to also talk about is feed. Because Pangasius fishes are carnivorous fishes, the feed is vastly different from the other species, and I'll come to that in a bit, but also antibiotic use, because they are also very more resistant to disease than other fishes. So there are a lot of, like, these are just four aspects, but you can see how each species comes with a whole different practice of like how they are reared, and then that also impacts what we would be maybe particularly interested in, which is law and policy, and how to, you know, make sure that the policies then do translate to fish welfare on the ground actually. So yeah, so basically what I wanted to say is that so in terms of consumption, which is I think like a good segue to what Sahana will be talking about, that is also you know, for instance, in India we have the caste system, and there's a lot of oppression and discrimination on the basis of caste, and that also shows up in how we consume fishes. So the scaled fishes are fishes that are consumed by you know, people who can afford to spend more on fish, and the non-scaled smooth-bodied fishes, which would be something like the catfish, are usually relegated to like cheaper food and lower socioeconomic groups. And that really means that when these fishes are farmed, farmers tend to cut corners, and what that would look like in one instance would be feed. So like I said, chicken offal, poultry offal is something that is fed to Pangasius fishes or carnivorous fishes. It is untreated. It's completely untreated, and I'm going to be showing a small, like 1-minute video so that you can get a little glimpse of how aquaculture looks like in India. But they're directly fed this, which is a huge, not only environmental concern, but also a public health concern, and also should, you know, worry us as animal advocates, because it means that the nutrition is inadequate. In terms of shrimps, it also means that So I think Amy spoke about, I'm not sure, but yeah, Amy spoke about insects being used as a product in shrimp feed, and that is something that's currently a conversation in India as well. Currently, innovation is only at a startup phase. I know that Brazil and a couple of countries have already started farming insects at scale, but in India, it's currently like only at an innovation stage. So again, looking at like how feed dynamics work is something that I'm interested in, and that would then translate to traceability. We currently don't have any traceability in India, which is why farmers can get away with these feeding practices and stuff. I think I just forgot to mention a small detail is that these fishes are raised in polyculture systems, the one that we were studying. So while we were focused on Pangasius as a species, they were being raised in close proximity with other species, including Indian major carp and Roopchand. So again, this has implications on how they are regulated, but I'll get to that later. So that's my time.
Yeah, thank you, Shreya. I think this was a very important reminder that, aquaculture welfare is not just maybe an abstract policy question, but it translates into very real, tangible consequences for, of course, the animals, but also farmer, workers, supply chain, ecosystem, right? And so I guess that will also inform the conditions in which reforms are then presented and brought forward. So, last but not least, Sahana, I would like to bring in the litigation and accountability angle here. So if you could please also introduce your work.
Yeah. Hi, all. It's great to be here amongst you all. So I worked with this law firm called Richmond Law and Policy, where I learned much about green and humane washing and how it's done and how it can be effectively tackled and addressed. So I did pre-litigation research and case development work against a seafood company for its claims that its practices in shrimp farming is sustainable and it's responsible. And my key takeaways is that litigation can be a very effective strategy in addressing intersectional issues, starting from the need for animal welfare standards to the importance of holding these companies accountable for their assurances to consumers. So during our discussion, I would like to emphasize as to how US food companies, the big multinational corporations, can be held accountable for their supply chains practices in the global south, where their aquaculture practices is causing a lot of environmental externalities. And so, so the seafood packaging claims which they make is false, it's misleading, and it is violating US laws, not one, not two, but it creates several causes of actions against these seafood companies because they're violating the law. So contrary to whatever they claim, in reality, shrimp and other aquatic animals in the global south are reared in inhumane, scientifically, unscientifically, and environmentally destructive form. It not only is inhumane against aquatic animals, but it violates even human rights, it violates the labor rights, and it basically creates a lot of externalities for vulnerable communities where aquaculture farming occurs. So throughout this discussion, I would love to talk about how consumer protection actions can be a very effective tool which public interest organizations can use in challenging these practices and addressing intersectional issues in a way wherein we can bring in long-term change, bring in behavioral change in how these seafood companies honor the packaging claims which they make. And I can go with a couple of case laws and as to how they are serving as a deterrent precedents against these seafood companies. And so looking forward to discussing this.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this brief introductions. I know we could spend like hours today discussing all the different areas that you work on. So we will try to just do a little bit of moderated Q&A, but I would love to leave more time for the audience to ask directly to our panelists more about their work. But yeah, let's get us started. So Becca, I would like to start with you again. So mentioning to what I was saying before, how is aquaculture similar and different from terrestrial animal agriculture, and what does that mean for animal advocates who are trying to design effective strategies?
Yeah, great, thanks. So as we've discussed today, and as I mentioned briefly at the intro, there's similarities in terms of what's at stake. The lives of aquatic animals are complex and rich and interconnected with members of their own species. They have some species, like tilapia, for example, have tight-knit family groups. So the stakes are similar in terms of the animals, and in terms of the scale, if anything, is much higher in aquaculture. But then the heterogeneity and the diversity that exists within aquaculture is a major difference, and I think leads to a lot of difficulty in thinking about approaches, because in the terrestrial animal case, if you're looking at an effective strategy, we know that in terms of the number of individuals that are being farmed worldwide, it's almost only chickens. And so you could, and those chickens and those chicken production systems vary a bit, but the production systems, there can be some like pretty blanket policy targets that you could have one policy that would have an impact on billions of chicken lives. And so the fact of the matter of the diversity in aquaculture makes it hard to take that sort of species by species level policy approach. So then you're left with, a broad scale approach to sort of protect fish, so-called fish welfare. But the problem with thinking about fish welfare, which I'm putting in scare quotes very deliberately, is there is basically no such thing. There's general principles of, you want to think about their psychological health, you want to think about their physical health, you want to think about their ecological and behavioral opportunities. But how that gets articulated into a particular species varies dramatically. We're talking about different body shapes, different body plans, so even slaughtering protocols, some, I think we talked about in the morning, some fish, will die quickly if you put them on ice, but other fish actually live longer when you put them on ice. That's true for, even just chemical stunning works one way in one species and another way in another species, because they are radically different as you mentioned. I would go even further, as an elephant to a chicken. So we're jumping phylogenetic groupings there. And that's something that is hard to draw out, I think, because you have this word fish that covers all of that diversity. So you can say the word fish welfare, and it means something, or it seems to appear to mean something, but I've never heard anybody talk about tetrapod welfare, which is the actual biological equivalent of what we're doing. So tetrapods are, the giraffes, the geckos, the human beings, the hamsters, the bats, the birds, all lumped together, snakes, all of the terrestrial animals, vertebrates are tetrapod. There are about 30,000 different species with all of that diversity. And all of the fishes can constitute 30,000 different species with a similar amount of diversity in both groups. So to talk about tetrapod welfare is like the equivalent of talking about fish welfare, and we don't do that. So that means that this sort of piecemeal approach is going to be an uphill battle, and we're always going to be behind the curve. So that's why we have to start thinking about how to get out in front of it. And that requires sort of new and creative policy solutions like the octopus ban that some of the people in this room have worked so hard on promoting globally. But I think we need to do more of that, and also just really start getting creative and thinking about recapturing the narrative and not just playing catch up.
Yeah, thanks. That was going to be a little bit of my follow-up question, if you could sum up the risks of treating aquaculture as one single sector, but I feel you extensively touched on that, which is great. Maybe linked to that, Sahana, can I ask you, building on this point that, of aquaculture and aquatic animals not really being one single system, one single species, how does that diversity affect, legal strategy? Now, for example, when companies make a welfare or sustainability claim about their seafood products, what should advocates, keep in mind or understand about the different species, production system, and supply chains behind those claims?
Yeah, so every species is farmed in a different way, or sometimes, it is clubbed in a way that the farming methods are kind of inhumane because it does not factor in or it does not consider the physiological differences in how a species is. So when we are filing a lawsuit against a company, the first thing what we look at is how is a particular species generally farmed, and then we start tracing back as to in which region it's being farmed, what are the destructive or adverse practices that the aquaculture farming is engaging in. For different species, it could be different. For salmon, it is net pen aquaculture, which has its own set of detrimental impacts on the environment and to the salmon, which is which could be addressed in different ways. And it can be the same with shrimp too. Shrimp farming, at least in India, is better regulated in, but then the eye stalk ablation is a huge issue. There are guidelines, but really nobody is following it. So it depends upon the species, it depends upon the region, it depends upon what they're practicing on the ground. So gathering factual data from region to region and seeing as to the sourcing practices the farms are engaging in will help to kind of navigate and use litigation as the right tool in addressing the various harms which are happening on the field. So it's kind of like we need to keep a pulse on what's happening in every region where the farming practices are going on, and trying to gather factual data and seeing as to which seafood company, like in the US, is sourcing from which particular region, and is there enough of evidence against the problematic farming practices, and then taking it from there. So it definitely comes down to differentiating between the farming practices to what's happening in geographical regions, bringing it together, and then seeing if we can successfully file a consumer protection action in protecting intersectional issues.
Yeah, and I'm curious, building on this, like, do you think that then the complexity of aquaculture, that you just discussed, do you think that's like a pro or a con, like regarding litigation, like accountability? Like, is that something we can explain in a positive, or does it make it more complicated?
It is both. So in certain situations, like with shrimp farming, there is enough of information to tie up all of these issues together. So just to give you an example, with the shrimp farming, which happens in the global south and in low and middle income countries, you will see intersectional issues where it's not just about the inhumane ways in which the shrimp are being reared, hatched, and farmed, but it also like very closely connects with the numerous amount of labor law violations which happen in these countries, because human rights are also not taken very seriously there. There is non-compliance, there is lack of enforcement of existing laws. So just hyper-focusing on that can help us to also address animal welfare issues, aquatic animal welfare issues. So although the animal welfare issues are not fully developed in the sense of aquatic animal welfare regulations, we can use these existing laws which apply to human rights, which apply to labor rights, in bringing in reform. And so in that way, it is a pro, meaning when you have enough of information, you can use that to start building momentum in addressing at least one aspect of it and improving the standards. But in certain areas, it is a con, because it's kind of impossible to trace the entire supply chain, and there is no transparency. It is convoluted, the way the system works. And like Hira was mentioning, the certification schemes are quite private in form, and they're privatized, and it's commercially vetted by the industry players. So that is the con. Like, we need enough of information to be able to successfully file cause of action, and we could we could do a lot more in the consumer protection or on the consumer protection front, provided we had that factual data. So for certain species, you have enough of information. For certain species, you don't. And for certain regions, you don't have enough of information. So it just depends from species to species and from region to region, and to what extent we have information available online. Like for certain companies, they have meticulous records of their bill of lading. That's like, their import and export data, who are their, customers, which is the US conglomerates. So they have enough of information, and sometimes these LMIC countries, players, processing facilities kind of edify their partnership with US and EU players, which is good. We can use that in showing as to how it, you can trace back to who are they sourcing it from. And sometimes it's just really difficult to find enough of information to hold them accountable. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think this already gives a hint that we need more approaches, and we need to fight and advocate in different ways in different spaces. And I would like maybe to move a little bit from the broader sector level picture, let's say, from what welfare looks a little bit in practice, and so particularly in contexts where farmers are operating also under this strong economic pressure, this push for more blue foods, this expansion, like we're hearing, like how is that in practice? So Shreya, maybe building on the points that we discussed now with Becca and Sahana about the diversity of aquaculture system, how does that show up in the Indian context? So what do we as advocates risk missing if we only focus at like the high level policy without really understanding what is happening on the ground? And I'm doing a very self check here.
Yeah, I think, for instance, in India, which is the second largest producer of aquaculture, and within India, there's a state called Andhra Pradesh, which is where a lot of work that Ridhi's been doing, a lot of study that I did was based. I think it produces close to 40% of the national production. And I think what it signals is that there is a huge scope to work closely and bring about impact, but then it also means that you're assuming that if there's a law, then there will be enforcement and it will translate to fish welfare. But I think what I have observed is that unless you figure out what are the needs of the farmers, no matter how much enforcement there is, it's not going to translate to the farmers actually implementing the policies. And I can just give you an example, and I'm going to be looking into my phone for the numbers because I'm really bad at this. So, for instance, so the study that I did, just for context, is based in a wetland that is protected under the Ramsar Convention. Eventually, it went on to be protected under the domestic legislation as well because it was being encroached upon by aquaculture. It started around like in the 1960s or 70s, which I could find. And what has happened is now we have like this biodiverse wetland of importance, international importance, being encroached almost, I would hesitate to say like at least 60%, but close to 70% of the wetland is encroached upon by aquaculture. And which is why when the Supreme Court was petitioned, there was a drive to demolish a lot of these illegal aquaculture ponds, and close to 5,000 acres of fish tanks were demolished. And this happened again in 2026, where it was reported that there was a Supreme Court order that on the basis of ecological destruction and violations, ordered for a demolition. And what happened as a result of that is the farmers just came back, dug their ponds, and they also tried to construct 0-point tanks. This is again a report. I have not studied, I have not gone to the site after this report came out, but the report is that these 0-point tanks with a depth of 4 to 5 feet are built so that they can bypass the regulatory restrictions. And so basically what happens is, advocates would be working really hard on creating a great legal and policy framework, but there would be loopholes, and eventually, there are like loopholes, and then you slip through the cracks, so to say. So if you truly understand where the level of change is, which is at the farmer level, at least I can speak for India, I don't know about other jurisdictions, but if you work at that level and you figure out what are the needs and what are the economic pressures, and then you decide on what your legal or policy strategy should be. I think that might be way more effective so that you can actually ensure that their practices benefit the fishes on the ground. So yeah, that's why.
Yeah, so from what I understand, like, I love that some of the work that especially we do like complement each other. Like a lot of the work that we do at the global policy level, I often say is like top to bottom. And then you're saying we also need the bottom to top, like kind of approach. So these are already kind of hints that is there really, should we really decide if there's a better strategy, or maybe we should like work on both. Yeah, I'm curious. Like, I would like to bring like a little bit of the farmers aspect into the conversation, because I agree with you. I think it's important to consider that as like partners, like at least like stakeholders of this conversation, because at least from my knowledge, they're generally not even like the main actors benefiting from this from this supply chain. So I would love for us to maybe just like stop treating them as just like the target of a regulation. And yeah, just want to hear maybe from all of you, like how you think we could find ways to collaboration. Why is that important?
Okay, I can start off. Yeah. So just drawing key takeaways from shrimp farming in India, the farmers are the ones who are putting in all the hard work in trying to raise shrimp, and studies also indicate that farmers deeply care about shrimp welfare, but then they are the ones who are bearing the brunt of as to how the price fixation happens, and how they are also the victims of monopoly players in global north countries. So they are not the ones who can call the shot, but at the same time, they're bearing the brunt of how taxing it is to engage in aquaculture farming. And there are a lot of investigative reports which have come out in the last couple of years, like Hidden Harvest, Outlaw Oceans, whistleblower report, Corporate Accountability Labs, Hidden Harvest, and many more. Even in Indonesia, like Net Profits, Human Costs. So they all focus on how the processing facilities in these respective countries are the ones who determine as to what price are they going to pay to the people like shrimp farmers and the people who are actually doing the work on the ground. And it's not just a farmer welfare issue, it's also about how vulnerable workers in the sector are treated. There's a lot of exploitation which happens in the labor market of aquaculture sector, and how abysmally poor human right protection even occurs on the field. So using these investigation reports in understanding the issue is like a starter, and from there we can build momentum in strategically collaborating with these vulnerable communities in seeing as to how we can help. And when there are available legal tools like consumer protection actions in the US, we can use it to bring in social accountability. We can use it to bring in environmental accountability and to improve animal welfare standards. Like for just enforcing these laws out in the global north can pressurize the supply chain to improve their standards of processing, to build a better approach to it, to actually improve transparency and traceability of it. And that is missing. So because there are laws, there is a lot of factual data which can be relied upon in improving the standards on the ground. So I think just using that with the law would help to push the needle, help to improve the momentum of improving the welfare standards for everybody involved.
Yeah, Shreya, if you want to.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add a point to what you said, because I really agree with this. When we were studying, farms near the Koleru wetland, we were obviously really shocked to see how widespread the poultry offal feeding operation was. But what was even more shocking is the most resistant to that practice were shrimp farmers. And that is also because they have higher standards to meet. And I think that, just having that also play out is so important, because no matter how much, again, like going to the same point, that if we have like the carrot, we have the stick, we also need a carrot. And this is probably a stick where the shrimp farmers who have ponds nearby are sort of like resisting these kind of practices. And if we are able to improve what are the minimum standards required on the consumer end, that then trickles down to what the farmers are also willing to do, because they know that eventually they have to, they are sort of growing the fishes so that they can have a market to sell it in. And if there is like awareness, then they will be more willing to bring the changes in how they treat the fishes. Because like for instance in India, it's so huge, the business, that you can't really target each farmer. Like maybe in the US there's like, you can target certain companies, but in India it has to be sort of like the farmer has to have the incentive to treat the fishes in a certain way, because there's no other way you can actually reach the whole network, so to say. That makes sense.
Yeah, I'd love for you, Becca, to bring in the multi-species, like a community-based perspective into this conversation.
Yeah, sure. I have a lot to say. I don't know how to sort of unpack it in an efficient way for all of you. I think maybe I'll just start by saying I think the word farmer itself is sort of like the word fish. It's papering over potentially a lot of different types of actors. So if you read the UN report on blued foods expansion, they talk about artisanal fisheries, and they talk about women-led businesses, and they talk about small holders that are, living, in food insecure places, and that's the reason then therefore for blue foods. But then there's other farmers that are essentially multinational corporations. And I think like the strategy has to be different. You can't have one strategy for incorporating farmer voices when we use the same word to cover, radically different interests. And I think that, a community-based approach of talking to people about what their interests are, what they think, their goals are, what they're trying to achieve, and in addition to talking to them, listening, of course. But then I think there has to be a realization that at some point, some of those interests have more power, and some of those interests, some of those voices are disempowered, and already, to expect them to be the ones to implement the changes is actually not fair either. Even if they're changes that they ideally would want to implement, if then they're going to get wiped out in some sort of like trade organization aggregator where they're, the way that they're farming and the way they want to be farming that they're proud of is getting lost because there's no traceability, as we were talking about last night, then it doesn't really matter. So I think, we have to sort of keep an eye on power, we have to keep an eye on affordances, and we have to keep an eye on, different strategies. And I would go so far as to say some more sort of punitive strategies for the big corporations that are aggregating wealth into the pockets of very small number of people versus coordinating with for example, it sounds like in Nigeria, where it's really mostly backyard operations. That just seems to me like a very different sort of problem, and just not to lose track of that because we have a single word farmer of somebody who we're trying to coordinate with.
Yeah, I think one point that this conversation raises for me is that maybe sometimes like the most visible actor is not always the actor with the most power, and similar, maybe the actor closest to the welfare problem is not always the best one positioned to solve that problem. So I guess this means that advocacy might need to focus on farmers, technical support. In others, we might think of to strategically target retailers, certifiers, investors, public authorities. I think there's, going back to what I said at the beginning, no really one size fits all, like one approach. And this is why I personally think that aquatic animal advocacy should really be designed around like we often say like power dynamics, or more like the systems rather than the welfare problem itself, because we just heard how the welfare issue can change based on jurisdiction and system, etc. So I have a ton more questions for you, but I would love for the audience to wake up and and engage with our panelists. I might come back to you with my questions, but please, this is your chance.
I am actually going to ask a question this time. So I'm involved, I'm an advisor to the Seafood Consumers Association in Australia, and one of the things I'm not going to be popular with for my CEO is that we just applied for funding for a traceability thing using blockchain in premium foods to China, and inside that, looking at how we can assure welfare and everything like that. Is that something that you are looking at? Is that something that you're aware of? In terms, so does it make sense? Does my question make sense?
I think I'm not following the question. So you're speaking about how you're helping the seafood companies to improve traceability.
We have a specialist who works on blockchain. So basically, it's not probably per fish. It would be per basket or something, and then you would know exactly. So if you had a piece of fish, because we know that the mislabelling is around 20% worldwide, then you would know exactly. We represent the consumers, so you know where your fish came from and whose boat it was and what beach it was and what breed it was. So I'm just wondering if this is something that you're looking at.
Yeah, so I just read a report about how in India, I think ASC, which is the Aquaculture Stewardship Council, is working with a farmer coalition to do exactly what you said in improving traceability, because they are recognizing that consumers are catching on to their misleading claims. So they are bringing in the exact approach which you're talking about in Andhra Pradesh, and it's still in the pilot stage, but it holds promise because every investigative report is talking about how it's a facade, where meaning it's just really hard to trace back. When they claim 100% traceability or 100% transparency, that cannot happen because more often than not, in India, the smallholder farmers sell it to an aggregator, and the aggregator is like a middleman or an agent, and he or she is the one, or the company is the one which is selling to these big, MNCs in India, in Indonesia, Vietnam, and so on and so forth. So what happens is that because the aggregators are acting as agents and they're clubbing and merging all of these killed animals together and then selling it off to other seafood companies, it's impossible. It's literally impossible to trace it back as to what is the sourcing method, what is the sourcing practice, under what conditions were they farmed and raised. So this would definitely improve traceability, and it would improve accountability. Farmers would have like a SOP, like a protocol, and they can just follow that. Or, it's just easier to it's easier to bring in a unified approach to improving traceability. So I think more and more seafood companies should do this, and that would bring in more assurance to consumers that they're picking in the right products and the products are traceable to the sources which they think it is to.
Yeah, we're starting with the premium ones first because it's a smaller population.
Yeah.
People are more driven by the provenance of it and want to be able to say that it's from this particular place. So that's that's their whole thing. But our grant has gone in, so
that's great, right? Because usually it's the premium products which claim these claims. And if they can do that, that is fantastic, because more and more consumers would choose that. They would use their purchasing power to make the right choices and decisions. So, a lot more seafood companies should be doing this,
Thank you. Going back to something, Becca, that you said at the outset about the importance of meeting people where they are to educate them about aquatic life, it makes me think that even within the farmed animal movement, amongst advocates who focus on animal farming, there's a lot of education to be done there as well. I experienced this personally. I have so much to learn about this. How do you view that? Would you like to see more education and focus on aquatic life within the farmed animal movement? If so, can we be a part of that? Or should we be shifting our focus more to aquatic animals because there are these early opportunities to affect systems? I'm sure there are groups who are working on chickens who say we have way more to do on chickens than we have time and resources for. But how should we think about moving this issue forward within the movement? Because it just does seem like there's a lot of lack of awareness, even on folks who think about this stuff all the time.
Thank you so much. I don't know if this is like way too self-interested for me to say this, but so I think my experience, and it sounds like it's been reflected in Abby's experience and maybe many other, and I think, more empirically, like I mentioned, the success of my octopus teacher and the Blue Planet documentary series, I think there is a latent interest. And I think that there is some fascination with the fact that we know so little about these lives. And that is like a very compelling entry point. And that then beyond that, to sort of say like, okay, we don't know that much about this thing over here. It's sort of foggy. That fog could be mistaken for nothing's going on. Like, that's why we don't need to worry about fish, because we don't, we're not sure, there's nothing there, and this is sort of coming back to this idea of burden of proof. We won't believe that there's something there until we can prove that there's something there. But the burden of proof can go the other way, where it's foggy, we don't know what's there. The potential is endless. We have no idea how complex their lives are. We have no idea how long some of these species live. We have no idea about what kind of lives they live and how rich they are and how surprising they would be if we would get to know them. And I think that the more we can sort of shift the default towards that sense of wonder and awe, the better. And that the way to do that is the specificity of particular examples, so proof of principle examples, so that, this idea that you can have, there's 30,000 different species, we don't know everything about all of them, but there's this one species of cleaner wrasse that coordinates with their partners and, knows the different particular fish on their reef and can make decisions based on their individual relationships. And they have these intense individual interspecies relationships. And they're tracking, they know who's a migrant, they know who's a resident, they know who's somebody who doesn't even come by, somebody who's transient, you'll see them every couple of weeks. These little tiny fish, they know that. That is their life, that is their life world. And if that's possible, what else is possible? What else are we missing? And so I think the more that we can sort of uplift those sorts of conversations about the fish themselves, including in these spaces. Because I think that I would imagine that at least at some point in some venue, with some conversation, with someone, each of you will want to be able to reach for a particular story about a fish and why they're so amazing. And just having those examples readily available and having like a rich source and a rich base of examples to draw from, I think would be of advantage, even if it's like not directly policy relevant, even if it's not directly even speaking to sentience, but instead just speaking to like their personalities, the richness and the meaning that they have, their like histories, their relationships. And even now we're seeing culture, intergenerational transmission of information that can get disrupted and have severe consequences for them, but also can be built on. So I think it would just be so cool to have a panel of just like, let's have a panel of like how cool fish are. And I would be very happy to be invited to speak to that. And I think that's true for terrestrial animal agriculture too. And one of the amazing things is that science is catching up there as well. There was just a study published that maybe you saw because it got a lot of press about this cow, I think her name was Veronica or maybe Victoria, who lives in the Swiss Alps. And she uses tools flexibly to like scratch different parts of her body. And it meets all the criteria of tool use. And we didn't know that here are these animals who we've lived next to for thousands of years and have, researched heavily about their welfare, but somehow missed the fact that, like, given a full, rich life, she crucially, as they mentioned in the paper, she was raised with her mother. Most cows are not. She was raised with her mother. She, lived on the mountainside, and she uses tools, which we take to be like, significant evidence of like a rich internal life. and somehow was a blind spot, even though we study cows pretty intensively. So I think the more that we can make space for these sort of like stories, even in these spaces, even if they're not directly policy relevant, I think they're relevant to the conversation.
Yeah, and let me just be more selfish with the with the answer directly. Yes, we need more people from the movement to join kind of the advocacy for aquatic animals. And I'm talking from my personal experience, because before joining Aquatic Life Institute, I was working at Animal Equality, focusing on cage-free campaigns, ovosexing legislation, which are all very important topics, and we should definitely keep working on those. But then I realized, like, sometimes I find myself, not just me, and other advocates, fully focusing on aquatic animals alone in a room of 300 people, which are industry policymakers that, let me just make one example. In May last year, there was the UN Ocean Conference. The theme of the conference was how humans can sustainably use the ocean. And we were the only ones that organized a panel on aquatic life and their welfare and how that is relevant to the ocean. And people were like shocked in a positive way. They were like, I never thought about that. At the same time, I was wondering, why is 3 NGOs here? And of course, I'm coming from a very biased experience, because I know we all have our hands full, but I would love, to see more space. And I think it's happening. Like, today, I think it's a good testament of that, but not just here. I'm aware that at AVA, like bigger conferences, that like animal advocates are indeed now entering, but I want more, so yeah.
Okay, I have 2 questions, but I'll ask one to give someone else a chance to ask as well. So my question is something that I struggle with a lot when I think about animal farming in general, but also aquaculture, which is the balance between outsourcing suffering versus ensuring like that bottom to top approach. So what I mean by that is, like, if in the global north is driving a lot of aquaculture demand. And so if we're focused just on enacting protective laws in certain global north countries, that means that, because they're so import driven, nothing is really changing in the global south. However, if we predicate global south supply chains on global north principles and their laws, then that essentially means you're kind of imposing your values and what you think is good welfare on certain global south countries. And so then you're not getting farmer or worker input, who again are working very closely with those animals. So like, how do you all, and this is for all of you, like, how do you strike that balance, and like, what do you think is a good way forward there?
I can, okay. So I agree on the first part, because yes, Global North is able to afford the best practices and be this, source of inspiration in saying that this is the kind of standards which everybody should be adapting, which is fair enough to say that you can't like be expecting everybody else to follow your lead. But that at least brings to attention the issues in the global south. And the thing is, global south, like for instance, India, has really well-written laws, like when it comes to, labor rights, when it comes to sexual harassment, which happens in the shrimp farming industry. Like every aspect which is an issue has a law in place. So bringing to public attention that these issues are prevalent and they're pervasive and they're quite perturbing in form will bring the governmental agencies to pull up their socks and be like, okay, we have laws, we need to enforce them, because everybody are watching. And also because there is an incentive, there is an economic incentive, like eye stock ablation, like ASC is phasing it out in 2026 and BAP, Best Aquaculture Practices, in 2030, which is fantastic because we already have the Coastal Aquaculture Authority's guidelines, which clearly say that you have to cause minimal stress to the shrimp, which is which the ice is being amputed, so you have to cause minimal stress, and there's a detailed procedure as to how it is to be done. Nobody's following that. And enforcing this, certification standards requirements will compel the enforcement agencies like Coastal Aquaculture Authority to really enforce the law, because the law is strong. It's just the implementation part of it which is lacking. And there, it's not about following what US is trying to say you have to emulate. It's about existing laws, enforce it, implement it. So like tying that together I think would help. So.
thought that was a good answer.
Becca, I just loved your response because I think it really helped us see fishes more generally. And I wondered if you would like to say some more and maybe give some more examples of different fish species culture or cooperation that might help us and inspire us.
You have 6 minutes.
6 minutes? Oh God, no, I don't think I should take all 6 minutes.
No, please don't. Up to.
Wow, thank you. Yeah, that was a public plant for that question, so I didn't even have to do it behind the scenes. In my own work, I think so there's so much work out there, and it really is. There is a hazard in science of the null hypothesis. The burden of proof was on showing that animals live complex lives and are sentient. But now we're just at this tipping point, I think, where Franz de Waal and Kristen Andrews wrote a piece that was published in Science. I think it might have been in Nature, but I think it was. Anyway, Science or Nature, high-profile journal saying we need to flip the null and have the burden of proof to show that the animals are not sentient. And so with that in mind, Chow and Chang and I looked at the research on fish pain and found that, any particular study on fish pain, people can poke holes in, because any one particular study, that it's not going to be complete because it's such a hard to study and talk about phenomenon. But what we did not find was overwhelming evidence that they do not feel pain. There is no evidence that they do not feel pain. It's just that any one particular study that suggests that they do feel pain is like, well, it could be explained this way, it could be explained. That whole body of evidence, there's hundreds of studies at this point, is consistent with them feeling pain, and there is almost no study that you can identify that is inconsistent with them feeling pain, almost none. So if the burden of proof is to show that they're not sentient, it's not actually there. Nobody has shown that fish are not sentient. And so running with that, just thinking about what their rich and complex lives are and just trying to understand them better, for me as a scientist, that really begins with slowing down, letting them tell me about their lives, and spending lots and lots of time with them. And that's, of course, really hard to do because they live underwater. And also, who knows if they want to have anything to do with us. I wouldn't blame them if they didn't. So one of the first studies that I wanted to do is that there's all of this anecdotal evidence of people forming friendships with fish, like individuated friendships. And I have people emailing me that, they had this intense bond with their goldfish who really loved them and would swim over to them every time they saw it, and they would put their hand in the water. And then there's YouTube videos of this, and, people even in the wild with, scuba divers going to the same location year after year and, getting to know a grouper. It's usually a grouper, some species of grouper. They seem to be really interactive. So I just wanted to see if we could document that, but I didn't know how it would go because, I suspected, but I wasn't sure. So we worked with essentially a backyard pond of koi fish. And when we first arrived, again, the goal was just to see if we could sort of create the kind of foundational relationship that's built on trust, where the animals would actually be able to express themselves fully when we're around them, and let us into their world to some extent, rather than imposing some external hypothesis of my idea of what counts as being a smart and interesting fish. I wanted to listen. But the first step is to have them not be terrified. And when we first got there, they were terrified. So a fear response in a fish, especially in freshwater fishes, is to drop to the bottom of the water column. It sort of gets them closer to protective safety and away from aerial predators, at least. So when we first got there, the fish, the koi fish, dropped to the bottom of the tank and swam as far away from us as possible. So they clearly did not want to interact with us and were frightened of us. And based on their history of interaction with humans, that makes sense because they were mostly netted by the humans. But we came back and didn't try to insist on interacting with them, but just made ourselves available. We also brought what we considered to be offerings to signal our benign intent. It turns out they like Honey Nut Cheerios, so we offered them Honey Nut Cheerios. And they slowly, started coming up and eating when we were there. They slowly started sort of swimming in a more natural pattern and not dropping immediately. They slowly started swimming sort of close to us. They slowly started sort of accidentally bumping into our hands when our hands were in the water. And then they started nudging our hands, just like a dog would when they want you to pet them. And again, with this, the cleaner wrasse study. So the cleaner wrasse study, this is on reef fish. So now I'm jumping into the ocean. Just bear with me for a second. So one of the things that the cleaner wrasse does is that they are picking parasites off of the client fish. And sometimes that can hurt, like when you're in the dentist and you pull too hard. They also sometimes steal the scales off of the fish, which is going too far. That is not okay with the client fish. And so there could be this conflict there. And the cleaner fish, when they did it by accident, they signal to the client fish that it was an accident with what is described in the science as a back rub. So they take their pectoral fins and they go up and down their back to say, like, no, it was an accident. And when they do this, the client fish doesn't swim off. But if they don't do it, the client fish swims off because, like, you're up to no good. And so this meets the criteria for reconciliation, which was first identified again by Frans de Waal in chimpanzees as considered to be the foundation of morality. Anyway, they found it in some cleaner wrasse. But then it started to prompt the question of maybe fish like the back rub. So then some other scientists looked at the back rubbing behavior and realized it dropped their stress levels and it insulated them from further stress. So apparently fish, just like we do, like back rubs, just like the dogs and the cats and everyone else. So it seems to be pretty fundamental to vertebrate physiology, at least. So we thought maybe our koi fish, now a completely different species of fish, would like these back rubs, and it turns out they really did. And so this became the foundation of our relationship with these fish, is that we would go and it was basically like, interacting with dogs or cats or something like that, where they really were seeking out tactile interactions with us and bumping our hands if we stopped. And so I was able to, and I just thought, like, this is how we're going to build the relationship, and then I'll use that as, like, ways to discover more about them. But it just was so surprising to me that we ended up just actually studying that, like, establishing that it is possible to create these interspecies relationships that are built off of trust, and that, like, they are seeking out interaction with us. They are not passively accepting it, but, like, actively seeking that out. And this the hand bumping behavior that they have, I thought, was a real surprise. So I went into that study without any hypothesis or any notion of how I was going to show any particular thing. I just wanted to sort of, like, listen and treat them as, just like, hey, I would like to get to know you. Is that okay? And then can you tell me a little bit about yourself? And it actually worked, and it really, like, to me was so much more interesting than if we had gone in there with an agenda. Like, I wanted to prove that they could, I mean, nothing against the mere self-recognition, but that I wanted to prove that they could recognize themselves in the mirror. Like, that would have been, like, set by me as something that's important to me, and instead what I discovered that what was important to them was actually interacting with us, which I thought was, even more sort of, like, touching to me. So, I think that those are some. I could keep going, but I feel like I've talked for too long.
I mean, this is fascinating, I think, for me, just like for everyone else. I wish we should do just one day just of dedicating. What is it that you proposed before? Like,
Fish Are Awesome panel.
Fish Are Awesome. For next year, maybe we keep in mind the title. Do we have more questions from? Ooh, okay, yeah, we do.
What time are we going to go till? Technically, we were going to go to 4:10.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think we're good.
Yeah,
Go for it.
one last question.
Well, one quick thing I wanted to add to Sahana's response to Hira's question, which I thought was very good, is to say when we're talking about imposing from the global north or seeming to, there's always great examples of the failure of the global north to do what they're supposed to do. And I think that can be used more proactively than we do when we can talk to people, especially smallholders and small-scale folks, so you're doing better, actually. If you do this, right, what you've agreed to do or what you're supposed to do, you're doing better than what's happening in the global north. And so I think turning that conversation sort of on its head will be very much more productive and can be seen, we can be leading in the appropriate ways.
Absolutely.
I actually wanted to add to that, and also what Hira asked. I feel like, definitely agree with that. I feel like even the production systems and how people farm and rear these species is also something that has been imported from the global north to an extent, I would say. And so to an extent, maybe it does work to think about, maybe dissolved oxygen is something that we need to look at, or, different entry points into how we can ensure fish welfare is also something that we think of from the global north perspective. And this is something that became really clear to me, especially when I saw a study done by Apurva's organization, Animal Law and Policy Network. And they'd done, I think for me at least, this was the first time I got a glimpse into how fish welfare is actually on the ground. So far, we've been thinking, okay, we're doing great on dissolved oxygen parameters or sludge removal or, these arbitrary parameters. But how does one fish actually live their life? And it was really shocking to me to see the spreadsheet that they put together from their data, because it wasn't just 1 or 2 or 3 aspects that the fishes were not scoring well on. It was literally like 90% of them, or maybe I'm exaggerating for effect, but it was so bad. It was just like red, 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 red. So for instance, and again, I'll have to look at my phone for this, but the different parameters were like, how is the liver function? How are their eyes? How's the gut infection, mucus, gallbladder, diseases? And liver was like fatty, fatty, damaged, fatty, fatty, fatty. Gut infection, yes, yes, yes. Moderate, mild, severe, moderate, mild, severe. Diseases, so there was like, I don't know the name of the diseases. There's like red disease, something called columnaris, and stuff like that. Again, it's not just one disease, like multiple diseases that affect their lungs, that affect their gills. And so that really makes me think, what kind of life are they even living? Like, do we even know if, we get so disturbed if we just have like a lung infection or like a liver thing, but having all of it at the same time just is really, and then they have injuries on their body, which we can also see. The video was clear, right? You saw them sorting the fishes, and so it's just like they're living, we don't even know how horrible the lives they're living, and this is like a really small study. It just makes me feel like this was a study that they did across, I think, a couple of species. So 1 or 2 fishes per species. We really need to gather so much data to understand how exactly they're living and what exactly we need to implement on the ground, because this kind of like broad-based framework that we're currently operating with and hoping that it actually translates to fish welfare on the ground, there's like so much reflection that we need to do if it's actually coming about, and we can feel good about, okay, like, dissolved oxygen is good, and so on and so forth. But yeah, till we actually know how the fishes are feeling on the ground, we won't really know if our campaigns are actually like translating. But yeah. So
Yeah.
that's what I wanted to.
Yeah, thank you. No, I'm just aware we are of time. And I wish we did a Q&A with the audience from the very start. But I do want to ask our panelists, like maybe one short question before we transition into the call to action session. So what is one, for time's sake, a strategic mistake that you think aquatic animal advocates should avoid when working on aquaculture?
I'll go fast. I think the inevitability of expansion and diversification is not something that we should accept. I don't think it's inevitable. We don't know what's going to happen going forward, and I don't think we should accept that.
Great.
I feel like we should really focus on research. I know we're all really keen to actually start working on the ground, but till we get like strong research to inform what we do, all of our efforts would maybe be misdirected. So that, and of course, farmer-centric interventions any day.
Yeah. I would say that unlike terrestrial CAFOs. Here, the impact of aquaculture is reverberating, and it's having long-term effects on not just a particular region in which the aquaculture farming happens. So I would say stakeholder engagement and coalition, like partnership with people across the globe is extremely important. Like what's happening in India is having an impact here. How the laws are enforced here is having an impact on India. So I would just say that stakeholder engagement is extremely important in the sector. So coalition is like critical to bring in effective advocacy in aquaculture.
Yeah.
Also, can I add just one thing? I feel like environmental interventions are so important because I feel like they are the ones that really have a lot of traction and they have a lot of intersection with fishes.
Yeah. So very good points to keep in mind. And maybe just to compliment on my side, because I just realized I didn't talk about octopus. That's a first one for me. But no, just to bring maybe that angle into the conversation. Yet it's difficult, coming from being an advocate from land farmed animals, that was hard. This is very hard, right? So we talked about the problems and the complexity and the fact there is no one strategy that we should pursue, not just one. But let's also remember that because aquaculture is expanding now, we might also find ourselves some golden opportunities, like octopus farming ban. See how I put it? That's really like, yeah, I know. It's a great opportunity because we don't have like an industry that is already entrenched, but also maybe something that I always try to say when I talk about octopus farming, yes, is about octopus. They are remarkable animals. They don't deserve to be intensively confined, but it's so much more than that. It's really about like the future of our food system that we want to design, right? Going back to what we were seeing today, like farming an extremely complex being like carnivorous species that is not suited to crowded settings or intensive confinement is really not the direction we should be taking when we look at the future of our food system. So let's remember that, yeah, we can use those examples. I always say octopus is my champion animal because it makes me put a foot in the door, right? And then what stops us from challenging whether salmon farming should actually be the right thing that we do. So yeah, just to leave with a little bit of positivity. And I think now we have the call to action session, so I'll pass it over to my colleague Tessa. Thank you so much, everyone.